3. A lot of the special effects techniques that we do in Maya require that we play every single frame. So when I click on the play here in my interface, and we look at the timeline down here below our render window, or perspective window rather, it needs to play every single frame. It cannot skip frames, otherwise Maya's not going to be able to do the necessary calculations for this effect. Now, in an earlier video, we looked at where you can change your playback speed in Maya. This does not affect the actual speed. If you were to render this out, it's going to render it out at 24 frames a second, regardless of how fast or how slow it plays in Maya here. Now, if I click on this little orange running man on the lower right here, found here, this will open up my preferences, and in fact it opens right up to my time slider preferences. And what you'll notice here is that I currently have it set to play every frame. This is absolutely necessary when working with nParticles because otherwise, if I change this to 24 frames a second, it will play it at 24 frames a second, and if necessary, it will skip frames. And that will make the calculations for our nParticles not work. So I'm going to switch this back to play every frame. Now I can click on max playback speed as 24 frames a second, in which case it will play every frame, and if it can, it will play at 24 frames, but if it needs to, it will slow down so that it can make the necessary calculations. This is typically the setting that you're going to want when you're working with nParticles. So the problem arises when we're animating other things in our scene, such as characters, where we need to be able to scrub back and forth in our timeline. Now with our nParticles, if I stop this from playing and I scrub in my timeline, you'll see that I'll get this message here indicating that the nucleus evaluation skipped frame change was too large. So it's not able to calculate because it's not able to, when I scrub in my timeline, in fact, you'll notice now that it's not calculating correctly at all. I cannot go backwards in my timeline. Going forward is a little bit better, but also that's not very predictable either. It's not actually doing the necessary calculations. Again, because each frame is dependent on the condition on the frame beforehand. There is, however, a technique that we can utilize that will allow us to scrub back and forth and still see our nParticle effect. So I'm going to rewind my, my animation here. And what I'm going to do is select my particles. Select them here in my outliner. And with my particles selected, I'm going to now go to nCache. And what we're going to do is create a new cache for our particles. So I'll click on this N object and we'll let it do its work. Now that it's completed creating the cache, I am able to scrub backward and forward in my timeline here, including being able to skip to whatever frame that I want. So what can't I do now? Well, I cannot really go in and change, I cannot go in and change the parameters of my emitters or my nParticles. I can't really work on them in the attribute editor, changing their lifespan forever, or I mean, changing their lifespan or you know, their shading or any of these other things that are affected by its setup. But having created this cache, you can see that it plays nicely. More or less, I guess the way that you can think of it is that we have baked in its behavior. Its behavior has been baked into the simulation here. This is actually quite valuable because if we're animating a character in a scene with the fire and we want the character to respond appropriately to things happening in the scene with the fire, with the smoke, for example, then we do want to know what it's going to be doing on any particular frame. So once you're done creating your special effect, in Maya using nParticles, it is recommended that you create this cache. Again, it's going to give you more flexibility because of the ability to skip around in your timeline as well as go back and forward and scrub in the timeline itself. I'd actually also recommend creating this cache before rendering out your special effect. That way you know what you're going to be getting. It can be a bit unpredictable if you try to render out a special effect without creating that cache. You might get results that were unintended and that you weren't expecting. So those are a couple reasons of why you should create a cache for your special effects. Now, one other thing before wrapping up this video, there are times, of course, when you're going to need to go back to your special effect and rework it. Maybe you need more particles or less particles, or you need it to start on a different frame, or whatever other changes you might need for your nParticle systems. And here's how we can do that. So I'm going to stop this. I'm going to rewind, go back to frame 1 in here. And what I'm going to do is delete the caches on these objects, on my particles. So I'll go ahead and select my particles here. And I will go to nCache, and here you'll find the option delete cache. And if we click on that, it will delete the cache, and now we can go back into the attribute editor for these particles and our emitters, and we can make adjustments as well as to the nucleus node. So here, let's just check this out. I'm going to play. Everything looks good, but if I scrub in my timeline, we once again get this warning saying that the nucleus evaluation skipped because the frame change was too large. As you can see, it's once again not behaving predictably if I scrub in my timeline. So that's a little bit about creating caches with nParticles in Maya. Thank you for watching.